Hi, I'm Liz Whiteacre. Let's talk about the line. Our goals for this lesson are to explore many different methods for breaking lines in poems. When you're a beginning writer, sometimes it can be intimidating to think that the lines in poems are just intuited by poets, that they're just kind of fully formed as they're drafting their poems and it just comes to them, right? And when we're starting out and we're drafting poems and the shape and the form of the poem isn't being fully realized immediately, there are quite a different number of techniques we can use to explore what might be best for the message we are trying to send to our readers. So, in this lesson, we will take a look at all of those choices we can make as poets and consider what types of effects those choices would have in our poems. We talked before as the poet is guide, right? Making intentional choices, creating a poem that leaves readers with a first impression, that invites them in, takes them on some sort of journey, if you will, and has them arrive at an intended place that ideally the reader will feel satisfied by. There'll be some sort of sense of resolution for them when they get done reading. As poets, we need to be flexible as we try to find the best form for our poems. We want to make sure that we're making consistent choices so that as the reader goes through the poem, every single moment feels intentional. If we've left out a piece of punctuation, there's a reason for it. If we've chosen to put one in when there might not be in other parts of the poem, there's a reason for that. If we have a capital letter, but then everything else is lowercase, why is that? Stanza breaks, line breaks, breaking in the middle of a line, which we'll look at today. All of those things should work together to help the reader have a great experience and come to an understanding of what it is you're trying to share with them as the poet. I wanted to start off looking at a fixed form, and so I selected the sonnet, which is a form that generally most of us have been introduced to in our youth. It is a form that's often covered in high school English courses. You might have had a literature survey course uh, for college where you took a look at some work that involved a sonnet. Shakespeare is usually pointed to, but I specifically selected the Patriarchan or Italian sonnet. This was created, developed by Patriarch, who was an Italian poet, kind of riffing off what Shakespeare had been doing in England. So, this is a fixed form that folks talk about, experiment with, know now, but it's also a form that was developed from another type of sonnet. So, it gives us some insight into how fixed forms or recipes for certain types of poems can change over the year by different poets who work with them. In a patriarchan sonnet, it's usually split into two sections, even though there's not a stanza break. We have what's called an octave or a grouping of 8 lines that's followed by a sestet or a grouping of 6 lines. And the reason why that happens is that usually in the first 8 lines, the poet introduces something that they want to talk about. It could be a problem they're having, something that they desire. It might be a reflection on their understanding of the world, or maybe something that's happened to them in the past. And then those remaining 6 lines, the sestet, usually offers some sort of resolution. Now, in Shakespearean sonnets, oftentimes there's a couplet or 2 lines at the very end of the poem that offer a resolution or solution. They even rhyme and are a little bit different than the ones before. But that doesn't usually happen in the Patriarchan or the Italian sonnet. And there is a rhyme scheme typically. You'll notice that the octave or the first 8 lines are usually in some sort of pattern that's repeated. Traditionally, patriarch would work with A, B, B, A, B, B, A, where the A sounds are the same and the B sounds are the same. And then the sextet did its own thing. So C, D, E, C, D, E, right? Introducing new rhymes. But again, as poets came to this particular version of the sonnet and patriarch already started to give some permission for making some changes, you'll see some different patterns happen. And sometimes poets, when they're writing in this particular form of the sonnet, they will include iambic pentameter or hexameter, different types of beats that are regular and consistent. In a previous video, we looked at iambic pentameter, that sense of the heartbeat, soft, loud, soft, loud, soft, loud. And sometimes poets will choose not to include the particular meter and have something that's inconsistent. So this particular recipe for the sonnet offers a lot of flexibility. Let's look at 2 examples. This is a fairly famous one. You may be familiar with it, by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She was a writer in England and she wrote sonnets from the Portuguese. This is the 43rd sonnet in that sequence. And we often know it as, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." I'm going to read it to you so that you can get a sense of what it sounds like. But before I do, I'd like to share with you the notes that I put into this poem. So you'll notice in the very first line, some of the words are bolded. Those are beats in the line that are stressed. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. And that connects with that iambic pentameter. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways, right? Which goes back to what Shakespeare was doing. You'll also see that the last word of the line is blue. And so I've identified by color at the ends of the lines those first 8, and then those last 6 are octave and sestet, so that you can see that, as we move through the poem. And then on the outer margin there, I've included the rhyme. And so we will use often when we're trying to scan or analyze a poem in this way, letters to represent those sounds. And here, Browning has chosen an ABBC rhyme scheme. So we have ways, days, height, sight, light, right, and grace and praise. And then in those last lines, use, lose, choose, and faith, breath, death. So as I'm reading, you can follow along and listen and see how those choices she's made in her poem affect our journey as a listener and reader. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. So I did put a little extra emphasis on those stressed words so you could get a sense. But there is a real sense of rhythm in there because Barrett Browning has put attention into the meter and the order of syllables, the word choices that she's made in order to make that rhythm happen. So that doesn't just happen on its own. You craft that as a poet. Now, I'd like to shift from this poem that's focusing on someone's commitment to another person, sharing with them how much they love them, to another sonnet that's much more modern. This sonnet is by Billy Collins. He was a past poet laureate for the United States, much more modern. We see from the title that this is called sonnet. So, kind of coming into the poem, he's inviting us to consider the form. And in this poem, he chooses to talk about it. So, I did the same type of notation here, but you'll notice that I left off any A's and B's on the end because we don't have a really specific rhyme scheme here. And he actually talks about that and the decision not to have a regular meter. We're not going to hear the specific beats in the poem. He specifically addresses that. So this is a poem that's talking about trying to write a patriarch or Italian sonnet. He even references patriarch in the poem, which I personally find a little funny. You'll notice these numbers at the end. Those are the number of beats per line. And if we remember Barrett Browning's poem, it was pretty much consistently 10 all the way down because she was using iambic pentameter or sets, 5 sets of 2 beats each, where it was unstressed, stressed. Here, you'll notice that there's variation in that because Collins is not setting up a very regular specific meter. And there is not a specific rhyme scheme that's repeated. We do have some sounds. You might think of them as assonance, consonants, rhyming, off rhyme, slant rhyme, where the sounds are kind of similar but not exactly true. Where we have some stuff happening like the n sound. We also have some assonance with the C's, beans, Elizabethan, right? We have that E sound. We have end and bed, which are not true rhymes, C's and beans. So there's a little bit happening here, but he's specifically not created an ABAB or ABBA scheme. So let's check this one out and see how it feels as we read it. All we need is 14 lines. Well, 13 now. And after this next one, just a dozen to launch a little ship on love's storm tossed seas. Then only 10 more left, like rows of beans. How easily it goes unless you get Elizabethan and insist the iambic bongos must be played and rhymes positioned at the ends of lines, one for every station of the cross. But hang on here while we make the turn into the final 6 where all will be resolved, where longing and heartache will find an end, where Laura will tell Patriarch to put down his pen, take off those crazy medieval tights, blow out the lights, and come at last to bed. So again, in my opinion, I find this poem a little bit humorous. Collins kind of thinking about writing a sonnet, and that becomes the content for his poem, kind of working through that form and the choices that the poet is making. Very different feeling, at least for me, reading it out loud. I did not kind of get into that groove of the iambic pentameter. And so I had to be a little bit more mindful as I was navigating. And then also, to me, it feels a little bit more conversational because we don't have those true rhymes being repeated at the ends of the lines. So I'm not exactly sure what to expect as a reader. So there's a little bit more surprise for me personally. I thought it would be helpful to look at one more fixed form. So again, when we're thinking about breaking the lines are set up in a recipe. They're telling us what to do. And so this one is based on syllable count rather than necessarily on beats in the line and end rhymes and a particular number of lines in the same way. So the traditional haiku recipe has syllable counts. So 5 beats on the first line, 7 on the second, and 5 on the third. The focus is often on nature or natural images. Form is usually simple, intense, direct. These are observational poems where the poet is kind of focusing in on an image and making either a meditative gesture or they're making an observation. They're understanding a truth that's in front of them. This is a haiku written by an Indianapolis writer, Etheridge Knight. He was a gentleman who was incarcerated and found poetry and wrote a lot about his life in prison. I've taken this haiku from a sequence of haikus that he's written. So this is the seventh in that sequence. And if you want to click on the link below, it'll take you to Poetry Magazine where you can see the full poem. And I hope you do that. It's an excellent poem. He's an awesome Indiana writer. So in this haiku, if you notice, I've put in the syllable counts, and don't be bashful. You get out those fingers and count along. This is how I do it. Under moon shadows, right? And that's to me the easiest way out. You can maybe get out a metronome if that's your thing. But let's take a look at Etheridge Knight's poem. Under moon shadows, a tall boy flashes knife and slices star bright ice. So here, Knight is kind of taking that idea of, nature, the natural, and pulling it into a world that he knows, right? Starting with under moon shadows, which gives us some imagery that places us in a scene. And he brings in human, he brings in an element of potential violence and danger. And then he leaves us with an image, perhaps a metaphor, slices star bright ice. And so as a reader, you might be bringing the idea of ice, ice. Oh, that's another term people have used for diamonds. Oh, well, that could mean this, that could mean that. So in this quick observation, we get to bring a lot to it as a reader, as we kind of sort through what our response is to also seeing this impression and this image that the poet, the speaker has framed for us. So this is following the more traditional recipe of the haiku. And this next one is a senryu, or a human haiku, which focuses a little bit more on humans, people, than necessarily the more natural world. But it does follow usually the 5-7-5. In this, another poet who spent a little bit of time in Indiana while she's being educated at Ball State University, Aubrey Cox, has written a poem called Haiku History Lecture. So she's starting with a very clear title that gives us the context for this haiku, whereas Etheridge Knight chose to name his sequence haiku and then number them, so we don't have the same context being presented to us. But she has changed up the number of syllables, and many modern writers will do that sometimes, where they will step away from the syllabic count of 5-7-5 or 4-6-4. There are a lot of different patterns that we can look to in Japanese traditional forms, but she has chosen a 7-3-4 for this particular poem. Haiku History Lecture, Doodling, Paper Lanterns. So in this, I imagine the student right, trying to pay attention to the lecture on haiku history, sitting there doodling paper lanterns in the margin. And so to me, this is a little bit funny, having been there myself as a student, but also to me, it's kind of commenting on awareness, mindfulness, being in the moment and engaging with what's in front of you. So again, as you are working with fixed forms, they're going to give you guidelines for how you're going to break your lines within the particular form, but there's always that ability to tweak the recipe a little bit to accommodate your vision and what it is you're trying to do. And that's important to keep in mind. The next poem I wanted to take a look at is the prose poem, because in a prose poem, no line breaks are used, right? The lines are just running from the left to the right of the margins, just like they do in prose, in your personal essays, short stories, novels, all reports, academic essays, emails, right? All of those types of writing don't use any line breaks. And so poets have adapted that as a style as well. And if you are finding it challenging to break lines at the start and you are working with a poem that might be a little bit more narrative, or you're working with a poem that might have a lot of stream of consciousness feel to it, where someone's mind is just racing, this might be a really great form for you to try out. So let's take a look. This poem is called Information by David Ignatow. This tree has 2,075,000 leaves. Perhaps I missed a leaf or two, but I do feel triumphant at having persisted in counting by hand, branch by branch, and marked down on a paper with pencil each total. Adding them up was a pleasure I could understand. I did something on my own that was not dependent on others. And to count leaves is not less meaningful than to count the stars, as astronomers are always doing. They want the facts to be sure they have them all. It would help them to know whether the world is finite. I discovered one tree that is finite. I must try counting the hairs on my head. And you too. We could swap information. So you'll notice as I read, I really only had punctuation giving me those momentary pauses, just like I do when I read a story, I read a letter, I read an essay. And so the poet is really focusing on not providing any obstacles as your brain reads through the poem. We start at the left, we go to the right, down, do, back and forth, just like watching a tennis match, right? Our bodies are trained to read this way, in standard American English. Other people read other languages in different ways, but it's very comfortable. We know what a period means, like we can immediately understand that. So there's not that slowing down for processing where we're thinking, okay, we got to go from here to here. We're really kind of given a very straightforward roadmap, if you will, and we just can get on cruise control and go right down the road. So for this, I really enjoyed this pick of form by the poet, because to me, this did feel very much within the speaker's head. The speaker's kind of thinking about this thing, rationalizing, exploring why it's valuable to him or her. And so it made a lot of sense to me to just kind of move through the poem very quickly, just like I would when I'm thinking to myself. Another type of poetry we've already talked about is free verse. And again, free verse is a poem that doesn't have a regular rhyme scheme and does not have a regular meter like the sonnet that we took a look at the beginning of this discussion. This is a poem by William Carlos Williams. You may have seen it before. It's in the canon in a lot of English classes. I picked it because I think it's doing some interesting things. So let's read it and then we will analyze it. Poem. As the cat climbed over the top of the jam closet, first the right forefoot carefully, then the hind stepped down into the round of the empty flower pot. So some things I noticed as a reader, I I had these pauses built in, right? Because as I'm starting to read, I get as the cat, and then there's nothing. So I have to pick up my eyes and go to the next line, climbed over. So even though when you kind of first visually look at it, it's like, oh, that's little, that's, I'll move through that really quickly. You're still asking the brain to hold on a sec. And as we move, and we can do that pretty quickly, but the shorter lines are slowing the pace. The top of, right, I have an additional line there. So we have a stanza break to get to the jam closet. So sometimes when you are making the line very, very short, it can build suspense because as a reader, I have to wait to get to that next thing. It can also slow down the pace. So when I'm writing poems, sometimes I go to poems with very short lines if I'm feeling, particularly meditative about something. In this poem, William Carlos Williams is just watching a cat make one movement, right? The cat is moving from the top of the closet that would hold jam. That's what a jam closet is. And then just stepping from the top of that into an empty flower pot that's happening to be sitting there. Um, what I enjoy about this poem is the poet is observing something that on the surface of it happens very quickly and maybe it seems very mundane and ordinary, but through putting this on the page and kind of being mindful, and we kind of have this really soft shape here, really slowing down to watch the beauty of the movement of that animal. He's taking something very ordinary and making it poetic, making it something of beauty that he hopes will appreciate. So that might be a moment when you would want to experiment with really short lines. I also wanted to point out that most of the lines are broken on words that give us images in our heads. A lot of verbs and nouns. So as the cat, right, we're given an image, and all of us just picture different cats. I know I pictured an orange ginger cat because that's the kind of cat we have that lives with us. You might have pictured a cat that you're familiar with. So now we have this concrete entity in our heads, and then we're thinking about climb over it. We're thinking about that action. Jam closet, we're thinking about some sort of cupboard. The right forefoot, the hind sitting down, this round, empty flower pot. And so we're really given things that we can hold in our head and that are going to resonate and maybe reverberate a little bit before we get to the next line. The only one here that's not working in that way would be of. We have a preposition there, the top of. Um, William Carlos Williams could have decided to put of on the next line, but I'm suspicious he didn't, because then that would have made the jam closet stick out really far and might have been visually distracting to suddenly have the jam closet out another 4 or 5 spaces. So he probably, wrestled. And then that is a moment of suspense. The top of, we're thinking of what, right? What comes next? And so that might be a reason to break on not a noun or verb or descriptive word. This next poem is also a free verse poem, and I'd like to read through it and then talk about what we are hearing here. So this is Solve for X by Oliver de la Paz. He is a contemporary poet, and you can follow him on social media and engage with him. So that's pretty cool. And in the outer world, the first something, smooth and wet, an X, skims across the tops of the crests in a succession of skips. The longest holds its space in the air, pauses, then descends into what is a cool sleep. X, and all the faces of backlit animals gaze downward at you, their curious, engulfed silhouettes, a spasm of radio and the accident of understanding what it means to be X, what it means to be held and kissed and gibbered to, as though you were something cast away and suddenly, miraculously, returned. All right. So in this poem, it's coming from a collection that De La Paz has written that explores becoming a father and having a son born who is autistic. And so to me, this poem is making me think of that moment of birth where X, like this unknown child, is born into the world, and that welcome from the parents, the medical professionals, whoever happens to be there, and that sense of suddenly trying to orient from the womb to that air, to suddenly being on the outside, if you will. I thought that De La Paz made some really interesting choices here, and I wanted to point out a couple things that are happening. The technique of enjambment is when you or a poet breaks a line in the middle of something. It could be kind of in the middle of a sentence, like we have in that very first line there, and in the outer world, the first something smooth and wet. So it's in the middle of the sentence. And sometimes poets will even do it in the middle of a word. He could have chosen to break at some thing smooth and wet and break up that compound word there. So enjambment can happen wherever essentially there's an interruption that is created. Certainly the break longest, right? We're breaking between the article and the noun there, and we're having to really kind of move our way carefully to make sure that we are following along and not missing anything in a way that's a little bit different than William Carlos Williams's poem, because he was breaking a little bit more on phrases. There's also the technique of the caesura, which is that little bit of space between the left margin and the word. So the third line down, X, because it's been indented there, and then the line longest because it's been indented there. We're given extra space, and it's that space that is the caesura, and you'll see it at different lengths. You'll also sometimes see it in the middle of a line. De La Paz could have chosen to say succession of skips and put in one or two tabs, the, right, and then move. So you'll see Sejura's work in a lot of different ways, and those are there essentially to provide a little bit more space. When I see N and I move down and there's nothing there and I have to kind of come across till I get to X, that's adding additional pause. Some poets also like to work with the caesura along that left margin or in the center of lines to provide a little bit more space and an opening up. And indeed, if you know this poem is about birth, about a child coming into the world, right? There's suddenly this enclosure and then coming into a great space from the child's point of view, and so it's kind of bringing in that sense of opening up in space, and being able to take a deeper breath, which is pretty cool. We're going to take a look at a poem that uses really long lines. This is called Perhaps the World Ends Here. This is by Joy Harjo, who is our current poet laureate of the United States. I hope you check out her work. Let's take a look at this and then talk about how her choices are a little bit different than some of the other ones that we've seen. The world begins at kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it, babies' teeth at the corners, they scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it, we make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended up at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. we give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. So I picked this poem to share with you today because I thought it was pretty interesting. This poem, much like the prose poem, uses longer lines. So the world begins at a kitchen table, no matter what, we must eat to live. That's a really long line. It almost will go to that next margin. We also have one line stanzas here. Right? And I want to point out that the little indent, if we look at the second stanza, the gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table, so it has been since creation, and it will go on. That little caesura, traditionally in a poem like this, means that this line is only broken there because it can't fit on the page. So this goes back, Walt Whitman. You might have been introduced to his book Leaves of Grass in your youth. He made this technique very famous. He's one of the poets that we look to, where he wrote such long lines the printer couldn't fit them in the book, and so they were kind of indented where they would go, which suggests to me that we're looking at really one line stanzas here, even though some of the lines are so long, right? If we had a bigger screen or we had bigger paper, they would be out there all the way on their own. And so the the stanzas then are really kind of organized as units of thought, like you might do in an essay or a story where you're kind of grouping like ideas. Each one of the stanzas are bringing an important point to the poem and exploring it. So that's why some of the stanzas are more than one sentence. Having the longer lines means we don't need to um, we don't need to break as often to lift our eyes above the page to go to the next thing. And in this, the lines are really driven by punctuation. We're ending on periods at the end of each one of these stanzas, and the only reason why we might break at then, they, we is again because of the constraint of our margin. If I made this box bigger, right, it would have a different line break, which I found really interesting. Being able to read more quickly and not having as many kind of moments where I need to stop to process things, like I did with the William Carlos Williams poem and Oliver de la Paz's poem, makes this feel a little bit more like a story to me, or an essay. It has a bit more of a narrative feel, and I'm able to read it more quickly because I can just let go and go. So I wanted to review the techniques that we just took a look at and have you kind of once again think about all of the different choices you have when you are breaking lines. And these aren't these aren't all of them, right? You will discover things along the way, but these are tried and true techniques that can at least get you started. When you're using them, again, make sure that you're making consistent choices, that you're thinking about your intention, like, why am I doing this? There should be a reason why there, and also making sure that you're making choices that will help clarify your message. So let's start off with the blue. We'll work our way around. You can think about the pace of your poem. If you would like it to move very slowly, then check out short lines. And if you'd like it to move more quickly, longer lines will do that for you. The prose poem has no line breaks. So again, if you're inside somebody's head and have stream of consciousness, maybe you're telling something that has a story to it, those might be really great reasons to check out the prose form. Enjambment, breaking things, right? In the middle can be a way to intentionally highlight things. It might, create a slower pace or a longer one. You might intentionally make some breaks to confuse readers and make them a little frustrated, just like your speaker might be frustrated in those moments. We also have the breath, your natural pauses. And so if you're ever feeling frustrated with your poem, I say read it out loud, record yourself, or have someone listen to you and make a little break on the page wherever you're taking a meaningful break. And those might be the best places to break the lines in your poem on the page. Thinking about punctuation, right? When you have commas and periods and em dashes and parentheses and colons and semicolons, right? That is a natural pause anyway. And so breaking on that punctuation can be helpful, or kind of thinking about things within a phrase or within an image. Finally, checking out a fixed form using a recipe that somebody else has created can be really helpful. And ending on images, something that's going to put an idea into your reader's head to hold on to, can also be a really engaging choice. And finally, often we're using a combination of these strategies. And so being flexible while you're in the drafting revision phase, trying out a bunch of different styles can be really helpful, so that you're either kind of proofing your poem, you know, okay, this is the right form for this poem, or you might discover some really interesting things in changing up its form as you're developing that poem. You might realize, oh, that's good. I need to investigate that further. And that's where readers can be helpful, because they can give you some advice on their experience and what they think might be better for them as readers. So something that you can do this week to practice this out is find a model poem and revise its line breaks in 3 ways. Really push yourself. So maybe you find a prose poem and you try it out with really skinny short lines and medium lines and long lines. Or maybe you try short and long and then caesures, or you try centering the poem and see what happens. And reflect upon, how does that change your experience? And why might the poet have published the poem in the way that they did? Then, after you've checked it out with somebody else's poem, try it with a poem that you are currently working on and see what happens. As you are working with your shape, your form, the different line breaks, these are some questions you can ask yourself, whether you are a reader of someone else's work or you are the poet and you're trying to figure out what you want to have happen before maybe you share it with other readers. So, some things I always ask myself as a poet or reader is, what's the first visual impression? Right? If I see something all over the place, I might have different expectations for what it's going to be like than if I see something that, I look at, I'm like, oh, that's going to be a haiku. Maybe it's not going to be a haiku. I'm going to have to dive in there to find out. How are you inviting readers into the poem? If you're starting the first line with enjambment that totally confuses everyone and derails the whole process, and they get frustrated and they never make it to the second stanza, maybe that's not the best choice to start the poem with, right? So that's something to consider. And are you establishing kind of the rules for the particular poem in the beginning that then you might play with later on and change up or be consistent with, so that the readers know what to expect? How does the line length set the poem's pace? And does that feel appropriate for the poem's content? Does it serve the voice? Is it helping establish mood? If you have a speaker who is absolutely frantic and just having a moment, is it appropriate for that person to be talking really, really calmly and slowly, right? So making sure that matches up. Where is emphasis placed depending on where those line breaks fall? And does that emphasis serve the message? If you're ending on the word before moving on to something else, right? If that's really highlighted, does that make sense? Does that make me feel hopeful or maybe despair? What kind of emotion might that be connected to? And then, is that building tension? How are you releasing tension? If we're constantly on the edge of our seats with all of the line breaks, how does that resolve itself? Do we end with some sort of comfort, or we end, oh, what's going to happen? Right? Everybody's in trouble. So kind of think about the emotional responses as you go through. How do the line breaks guide the reader? Are there places when you share your poem with people or when you're reading somebody else's poem that you get confused? Those are places definitely to give a little bit more attention to. Are the line breaks, do they feel intuitive? Can you or someone else read through the poem and barely kind of even notice what they're doing and why they're there, right? We can read through the poem and just enjoy the poem, and then read through a second time and figure out, like, Oh, why was that so smooth? Why was that so cool? Right? Why does that resonate so much? Ah, because they did these different things. And then finally, do your choices become thematic? And we'll be talking about this more as we move forward with these different discussions. Um, to me, that means, for example, if I have a prose poem, my speaker is very upset, moving through very, very quickly, maybe even punctuation is starting to break down as the person is getting upset and more upset. And then there's a kind of a turning point, and that person pulls it together and finds a place where they are okay. And we can slow things down, right? Maybe punctuation comes back in and demonstrates the control that the speaker is suddenly feeling. Right. That is super cool when the punctuation and line break choices and spacing choices you're making are kind of supporting the emotional tenor of the poem, or kind of supporting what it is the speaker in the poem is talking about. And that's always a really fun thing to explore as a poet, and also a really fun thing to experience as a reader. So, a writing prompt for this week, if you are interested in the challenge, is a line breaks prompt. So, I'd like you to take a poem that you've already written. And if it's a poem that is very slow, change the lines to quicken the pace. And if it's a poem that has not got enjambment in it, play around with that a little bit, or think about how you might show distress or peacefulness in the poem. So, thinking about the poem's mood. So, you can do all of these things and come up with a couple different poems, or try to do all 4 or 5 things in the same poem, but really play around with, okay, I know what I want to say. Now, what are the different ways I can say it? And which one serves my message the best? Looking ahead, we're going to take more time to consider how we are crafting our poem and readers' responses. And then soon we will be heading into how do we engage with our readers and solicit feedback and use that advice, as well as our own different types of strategies to revise our work. I am looking forward to seeing what you create, and I hope you enjoy exploring lines in your poems.